Hello, everyone. So my capstone is called Finding Pathways for the Private Sector to Invest in Nature. So I'm Christina. I'm a joint MBA and E-IPER student, and I'm taking the Human and Planetary Health track. And I grew up watching Animal Planet in Athens, Greece, wanting to save wild animals and being in awe of the natural world. Then I moved to London, and I joined the corporate world doing sales. So I kind of forgot about all that. And then one day, my friends took me to an exhibition called the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, where I saw photos like these. This was my favorite, so I put it on. And this. And these reawakened my love for living creatures beyond humans. But then the exhibition took a turn, and it reminded me very vividly that our natural ecosystems are being destroyed, and hence the homes of these beautiful animals. So this story is actually one of the main reasons I came to Stanford, wanting to protect these animals and their homes, and wanting to see the beauty of our natural world preserved. This is from the exhibition, but it's actually a photo from Greece. So being in corporate sales, I realized that there's so much money in the private sector, and there must be a way to reorient that towards helping the natural world. So clearly the incentives are misaligned, and I wanted to figure out a way to realign them. And this raises the question, don't we get benefits from all this nature? From clean water, from fresh air that trees give us? Well, we do get benefits, and there's great news here that there is a solution to measuring those benefits. So fast forward to my first E-IPER class, I was introduced to the Natural Capital Project. And what is the Natural Capital Project? It consists of an incredible group of people, Lisa being one of them, who's right here, who's my advisor for this project. And they operate right here out of Stanford, and they work mostly with the public sector. And ultimately, NatCap gives decision makers tools to make investments to allow nature, and then ultimately humanity, to thrive. So how does it work? This is an example of a model. So NatCap has a main modeling tool called Invest, and they can build models for a whole range of use cases that measure the value that we get from ecosystems in monetary and non-monetary terms. And in this slide, we see an example of the health of a water stream. So the input would be things like fertilizer being used in the surrounding areas, and then also vegetation that keeps that fertilizer out of water streams. And then the output would be value in terms of tons of pollution avoided, water treatment costs avoided, and number of people with clean drinking water as a result of all that. And a very cool part of all of this is that NatCap can also show scenarios of what different decisions would impact in terms of these values. So for example, if you were to reforest or deforest, what would the outcome be? So now my question became, how could NatCap amplify their impact through the private sector? And so with Lisa, we kind of came up with this. So two different parts to this question. First of all, finding the demand. So who cares about valuing nature within the private sector, and what is it that they really care about? And secondly, finding leverage points for NatCap to practically scale. And could they potentially partner with different entities? So these are my methods, starting off with some literature review to see what's already available, and then doing some semi-structured interviews. And I categorize these in two. First of all, it's a range of people who understand natural capital. So that's people literally that work at NatCap, an environmental economist I spoke to who has a lot of in-depth knowledge, also a lot of our classmates who work in this space, and also potential partners that NatCap could have. And then secondly, decision makers within the private sector. And here I was actually very lucky that there's a different student group at Stanford that's working on sort of a similar problem, trying to understand how the private sector values nature. So collectively, we spanned across of industries and roles in terms of who we spoke to. And this is the theory of change I had in mind when doing these interviews, which is basically ultimately going from the right. The ultimate outcome is restoration and conservation of natural ecosystems. To get there, we need investment. And to get to investment, we need to show the benefits of investing. So what were the findings? Here you see three main drivers, but I'll just first of all say that this is a very new space in terms of people's understanding. So in a lot of these interviews, we would ask about nature, but the answer would be about climate. So people misunderstand the difference between those two. And this is also confirmed by the research that you see here. So basically, this is a McKinsey slide that shows, you can't really see it too well, but at the top it's how companies right now have targets around climate change, and then the others are all the other nature-related metrics, like biodiversity loss, which is highlighted there. And you see they barely have any metrics around that. But then let's still look at the three categories. So first and foremost, the most important one are nature-dependent companies, because what they ultimately want to see is a financial return. So either related to risk, so avoiding some sort of cost, or finding some sort of revenue stream. Then we have companies that care, which is quite nice that those exist, but there are not too many of them, and most of them are still focused on carbon and not nature. And then lastly, there would be demand if there is regulation, if companies would do it because they have to do it. But this is still a very, very early kind of like space, but I'll talk about this more in a second, because there are tailwinds and it's quite exciting. So here I've just listed a few models that Invest has that could show financial benefits. I'm not going to go too much into them, but just to highlight one, for example, crop pollination. With crop pollination, we can show that more wild pollinators would lead to increase in yields in crops, and hence higher financial returns. Okay, so that's finding the demand. Now let's look at scale. We categorize three potential options. The first one is NatCap partnering with consultancies. So NatCap doesn't want to themselves consult, but they are happy. It's funny looking at you, like, this is right? That they don't want to consult, but they are able to provide the data and the science behind decisions, so they can scale through other companies. Then secondly, we have the potential of forming an industry program within Stanford, which would basically allow them to have members opt in to getting a lot of this information. So we've explored that option and sharing information with Lisa around that. And finally, this more exciting part, which has a lot of uncertainty still, but is potentially becoming embedded in standards and would hopefully something that will become regulation. So what is this TNFD that I have here? It stands for Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and you may have heard of TCFD. And basically, TNFD is an international initiative designed to provide a framework for how organizations can address nature risks and opportunities. So their mission is to halt and reverse nature loss, very aligned with what NatCap is doing. And members represent financial institutions and corporations worth over $20 trillion in assets and span 180 countries. Despite that, in interviews, people still didn't really know about it, and that may be because it hasn't fully launched yet. This is launching in September. So now we're looking at, okay, what role could NatCap play within this? And this is the role that I'm most excited about that they could play. So scenario guidance. TNFD have figured that scenario projections are crucial, giving basically tools to organizations to understand the consequences of climate change and nature loss, and also the consequences of different decisions that they would take. But they haven't yet figured it out. But NatCap can do this. So we spoke to TNFD and told them that, hey, what if we could show you that this is actually possible through NatCap's Invest models? And the answer was, that would be gold dust. So that's quite exciting. So the uncertainties and risks here. First of all, are financial measures good? Financial benefits may not always be clear from these decisions. And also, it seems to me that NatCap has sort of avoided leaning too much into financial benefits. Also because environmentalists and other people sort of criticize this idea of commodifying nature and just talking about it in financial terms. Ultimately, I think it's really important because this is the language that business speaks. Secondly, will TNFD become a required standard? We don't know, because people really, literally don't know about it yet, but hopefully it will, and that would be really exciting. So conclusion, this just summarizes what I told you. So the private sector will invest if they see a financial benefit, and the Invest models could show this and help them plan scenarios to mitigate risks. And also, they would invest if they have to meet reporting standards. And the leverage points are looking at consultancy partnerships, which we will explore, and also, very importantly, communicating the benefits of what NatCap can do to the private sector, which we can do through TNFD. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, it's a great presentation.
Wow.
I And I love that you brought up the TNFD. So I wanted to ask more about that. Like, where do you think it's at right now? Where do you think it's going? And what do you think is the pathway to getting it the same kind of regulatory recognition that TCFD got?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be more hopeful if people, so the companies that I spoke to, and then also that this other group that I mentioned spoke to, hadn't heard of TNFD. So it's hard to say right now, but because of the success of TCFD, so TCFD right now is, the disclosures are mandatory.
Right.
Even speaking of EVs, even Tesla in their latest investor day said, now we're going to start reporting on TCFD, right? So that's very promising, and TNFD ultimately want to just become part of TCFD, like they want it to just be integrated into one thing. And if that happens, then yeah, that would be great. But I think it's a lot of big companies that have the space right now to look at this. TNFD ideally wants to be spanning across different sizes and industries. And so with all of this stuff, I think we have to lean on the companies that are most mature in these spaces, and for them to make like it's not going to be suddenly everybody's going to implement this.
Yeah.
So hopefully big companies that actually care about their brand will do this, and then slowly others will follow. I don't know if slow is good enough, but it's something at least. Yes, Gus? Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of corporations understand the concept of carbon
Yeah.
and not nature. And I'm wondering, how do we make corporations care about nature when they're just starting to care about carbon?
Yeah. I think we focus on the ones that are actually dependent on nature. So otherwise, it's still too foreign of a thing. Then again, we see a lot of communications campaigns work with like Save the Whales or whatever. So that could be a different way to get them to care, like through a lot of campaigns like that, which ultimately get consumers more interested, which then make companies more interested. Because, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to create change and a lot of different angles we could start. So a culmination of a lot of them would probably be important. But yeah, I think maybe in terms of actually caring the most would be the ones that are mostly dependent on nature. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Thank you.